Before the video gets started, I wanted to give 2 special shoutouts. The first is going to my one and only patron on Patreon. If you didn't know, I do have a Patreon. I am trying to raise money for a website and an equipment upgrade. Because of the unpredictability of YouTube lately, I'm just trying to cover all of my bases. Please do not feel pressured to. I'm just letting anyone know who might want to know. Secondly, I have to talk about Firmoo. Firmoo is a glasses company that contacted me and asked me to do a review on their glasses, and in exchange, they gave all of you guys a special deal. And in the description box is a link for a buy one get one free offer. I didn't get any money from it. I won't get any money from it. It's just for you. They were super easy to use. They were pretty inexpensive with a ton of choices, and it took about 2 weeks to get here, but it was totally worth it. I highly recommend that you check them out. And now, onto the video. An officer of the law takes an oath and wears a badge that says they intend to uphold the law, to protect and serve. And while there are many that take advantage of the power they have been given and abuse it, there are 10 times more good guys out there. Not only do they protect and serve, they go above and beyond. They see and hear things that would traumatize the average person, and many end up having to walk away from the nightmares they watched unfold. While many of these stories are graphic and horrific, they are nothing to experiencing them firsthand. Also, these aren't even the worst ones. The link to the story in the description box is there if you want to read them all, but I am warning you, if I didn't read them here, there's a damn good reason. Here are 12 of the worst criminals these cops ever had to arrest. Enjoy. It's the ones with the kids that get you the most. A woman who was a wife of a Navy member was also a gamer. She had 2 kids, one 6 months and the other 2 years old. Husband was deployed. She was so into the role-playing game that she just sat there and let her 6-month-old die in the crib. 2-year-old could get food on his own. Mother found 6-month-old dead in crib and wrapped the body in a trash bag. Body starts decomposing and smelling, so she put the body in a box outside by the front door. All the time going back to her gaming. She comments online that her baby died. Husband comes home from deployment and finally gets from her that the baby is dead in a box outside. He talks to a superior the next day who reports it to police. Side note, she also did not get up from the computer to pee or poop. Use your imagination on that one. I had another case of a mother who locked an 8-month-old in the room and let it die. X-rays of the girl showed over half of her bones had been broken and were in various stages of healing. These are the times that stay with us and eat at us. The memories never leave, and you can never stop thinking about how those poor kids died. I didn't do the actual arresting of this one, but I spent several months supervising Kristen Burry in custody after she and her husband, Joseph Walsh, were arrested for killing their infant son, Chance. Her husband beat Chance during a drug bender while she watched and complained that they would get caught, saying, "You're gonna fucking kill him," and recording audio of the incident on her phone in case they were caught. Her husband shoved a baby wipe down Chance's throat, where it got stuck and he started to choke. To get it out, they pried his jaw open with pliers, breaking it and tearing out Chance's little tongue. When they finally retrieved the wipe from his throat, they left him to slowly die of his injuries in his crib. Kristen posted a Facebook message the day after Chance died saying how she was excited for their first family vacay. She never called 911. She said she didn't want to lose both people she loved in the same day. They left Chance to decompose for several days. When the smell overwhelmed them, they wrapped him in garbage bags and put him in a closet for several more days. Then they buried him in a trash pile near a homeless camp and took off to start a new life together, like Bonnie and Clyde. While in jail, she was insufferable. She talked endlessly about how much money she was getting in support and bragged about how much commissary she could buy. She cried during NA meetings about how her son was murdered by her husband, and then turned around after the civilian meeting leaders left and talked about how Joseph is the love of her life and she'll never stop loving him. She was quick to become angry over little things and routinely tried to either intimidate or impress other inmates with the severity of her crime. She asked me to print a picture of her son out so she could have a picture to take to prison with her. She also asked me to look up publisher information so she could write a book about her experience. She is absolutely the worst person I have ever encountered, and I had the hardest time of my professional career dealing with her pure sociopathic tendencies. She was not an abused wife who was conditioned not to cross her violent husband. She gave her first child away at a Denny's. Her second died after developing an infection that no medical care was sought for. And she helped brutally kill her third child. She deserves the death penalty, and it's a shame she won't get it. This was my first domestic violence arrest, and this guy was the worst of the worst. Verbally and physically abusive, stealing money from his pregnant wife and firstborn, blowing it all on booze and pokies, and culminating him in using industrial glue to seal his 4-month pregnant partner's lips shut, requiring her to be hospitalized in the hopes it would cause the fetus to terminate. Family violence section had been hunting this dirtbag for months, but he was a slippery customer. One night, we get a call from a local pub, saying a guy had gotten maggoted and gotten into a car. They got the number plate, and I recognized it as being this little scrote. His direction of travel was listed as being toward where I knew the girl lived. My partner and I set a land speed record getting there, but found no trace of his car in the surrounding area. We knew this guy was nearby, though. Sometimes you just feel these things. So we woke the still pregnant girl and explained to her we believed she was in imminent danger and that we would stay in the area. We gave her the response mobile phone number to ring and a phrase to say rather than call dispatch, which can cause a delay in sending out the job. Then we left. We both got in the car and drove around the corner. I dropped my partner off, and he doubled back to keep an eye on the front of the house, while I parked up around the corner, and our sergeant arrived in an unmarked car to view the street behind the house. Sure enough, within 10 minutes of us leaving, we suspect he had been hiding out waiting for us to leave. The guy saunters up the driveway and makes a beeline for the door, where he is confronted by my partner. Realizing he has been tricked, he punches my partner square in the jaw. Now for the record, my partner at the time was an absolute beast of a man, who was more offended by the fact that somebody had laid hands on him than he was injured. Let's just say the next few minutes went poorly for our young Casanova, as me and the Sarge came hearing around the corner to assist with the arrest. Sadly, we never got a conviction on the scrote, but we were able to get assistance from family violence to help the victim pack up and move interstate away from the situation. It still annoys me that he would go on to offend against other women, but at least we managed to help that one woman. She did make contact with our family violence section sometime later, and they tell me she is doing well. Sometimes in this job, you have to take your victories where you can get them. I'm terrible with dates and time frames if I didn't write it down. But I will never forget October 26th, 2013. This was in Brooklyn. Squad called in 85 at such and such address. A neighbor had called in an assault in progress, and the detective squad happened to be on the block for another reason. They got there fast and met the perp coming out the front door. We get there a couple minutes after the perp is being walked in handcuffs to the car. I went into the house to see if everybody was okay and what the 85 was about. Long story short, perp hacked a woman and her 4 kids, including an infant to 12 years old, to death with a meat cleaver. Mom and oldest were still breathing when you came in the door, but not for long after that. 3 babies were all in the back bedroom. The apartment looked pretty much like what you would imagine. You could taste the blood in the air. There was so much of it. When I walked out to get a look at the perp, a detective told me, "See if you can get his name, but don't ask him anything else." Guy was seated in the backseat in handcuffs and had a look in his eyes that I can't even describe. But I will tell you this: the devil was let loose in that apartment. Had a call once in a major metropolitan area some years ago. The fire department called us for help, saying that they had been threatened by a knife-wielding maniac while attempting to render aid to someone. My partner and I arrived and saw the fire department just standing around, so we're thinking, okay, this guy is probably gone, and we will just have to take a report for them and go to our next call. That's the first time I heard the screams of someone about to die. The shrill terror in a person's voice is completely distinguishable from your everyday scream for help or yells of anger. It sends a shiver down your spine. My partner and I didn't have time for backup to arrive or take tactical plans, so we entered an apartment complex by ourselves and followed the screams until we located a door we thought the noises were coming from. I kicked in the door, and we entered to find that knife-wielding madman stabbing a woman in the chest. Shots are fired, and the man goes down. As though a scene from a movie, after the shooting, backup comes running in to clear the rest of the apartment while I awkwardly handcuff this man who is bleeding all over my uniform. He's missing either his radius or ulna, one of the 2 wrist bones, from a bullet shattering it. There's blood everywhere, and you can smell it in the air. This is also the first time I held a person while they were dying, which isn't particularly pleasant either. The man passed shortly after in the ambulance, even with the fire department outside already. We later discovered that the man was on drugs and suffering from mental illness. He had attempted to kill himself a week prior and failed, so the higher-ups believed this is how he wanted to finish himself off. The woman survived. I had to respond to a home for attempted suicide with the individual still armed with a knife. When we arrived, the suspect was walking down the side of the road at 3 a.m., covered in blood from having cut himself over most of his body with moderate to deep cuts. He was covered. While we were standing around ordering him to drop the knife, he stood like a statue, not saying anything, just staring. This guy was 6'5", 220, who looked at me, 6 foot, 160, and said, "I'm going to take your gun and shoot him," referring to my FTO at the time, who was similarly built to me. I deployed a taser, which did nothing but make him angry. My FTO deployed his, which brought him down. Trying to handcuff a man covered in blood is terrifying. He was transported to the hospital for his self-inflicted wounds. However, upon further investigation, this guy had been luring cats and dogs to him, which he would end up killing and skinning. In this guy's shed, he had a harvesting room where he would turn the pelts of these animals into clothing. You name it, this guy had it. The entire thing reminded me of some horror movie with a stench you could not stomach. This was my first week as an officer. I've been on now for over a year or so, and that is the only guy I have ever met, I believe, could have taken my weapon and killed me. He was later declared mentally sound and charged. Also, he was not suicidal but angry, because he messed up on one of his creations. Grabbed a guy walking down the street with a shotgun. We get the cuffs on him, and he starts getting all chatty in the car about all the other guns he has. One thing leads to another, and we use his statement to get a warrant to get the rest of the guns. We go to the apartment with the warrant, and there are hundreds of different firearms and corresponding boxes of ammo. So we start cataloging it and carrying it out. Then, we notice cases of photo albums and videotapes. And it's child porn. I take random samples, and as difficult as it is, confirm that it is indeed children being photographed doing sexual things. It's logical that given the sampling that the rest of it was kiddie porn too. Well, not enough for the ADA who took the case. I explained to her how we arrive at the number, and she said that in order for him to be charged for all of the porn, that I would have to testify that all of it was indeed porn. I was the arresting officer. I was swearing out the complaint, and I also had to make sure the asshole went to jail for a very long time. So I sat in a room in the station house for hours on end, going through hundreds of photo albums full of children being destroyed. I viewed videotapes of innocents being swept away, and in the end, I wept. I did not stop crying for days. 20-some-odd years later, I still have my moments, and every so often, I'll see a kid that looks familiar, and I'll have a flashback. It haunts me constantly because I couldn't save them. I'm supposed to defend the ones that can't defend themselves. That was my sacred vow, and yet all I could do was catalog their horror. Years later, I was a first responder to the World Trade Center attacks and saw horrors that no person should ever have to see, and yet 9/11 wasn't even close to being my worst day on that job. Several years ago, I was called to a rural residence in my jurisdiction for a heated disturbance involving firearms. When I arrived on the scene, I saw the son standing with a handgun in his hand and the handgun stuck in the mouth of the grandfather who was on his knees. This took place in the front yard of this residence. My camera and audio was rolling due to me running lights and siren to this call, so all of this has recorded and played a significant role in the prosecution. I slid to a stop and exited my car while taking cover behind the driver's side wheel well. I had my Glock 34 out quickly and began giving commands to the son. He was in tears and screaming. The grandfather was motionless on his knees with a gun in his mouth and hands up. The son was screaming at me that the grandfather had been sexually assaulting his daughter. I told him repeatedly that I was here to help and all that good stuff. He took the gun out of the grandfather's mouth and threw it behind him in the grass and stuck up his hands. I moved forward and placed him in handcuffs, as well as the grandfather, due to me not knowing anything else about the situation. I then recovered the firearm and placed it in my vehicle. I confirmed the only other person at the residence was the child, who was inside at the window and watched this all unfold. My help was on the way, but still 20 minutes away. I brought the son in front of my car to be recorded and asked what was going on. He explained that he, his daughter, and his father, the grandfather to the child, all lived at the grandfather's house due to him losing a job recently. The son had had a tough time after coming home from Iraq and holding a job. The son goes on to explain to me that he asked the grandfather for permission to use his laptop. He received permission and began looking stuff up on the computer. The son proceeds to find a suspicious-looking folder on the desktop and opened it. This folder had hundreds of pictures of the child in extremely explicit positions, as well as performing sexual acts on the grandfather. Needless to say, he flew into a new dimension of pissed off and immediately retrieved his handgun and dragged his own father out in the front yard to avoid bloodying up the house, in his own words. He pistol whipped him and placed him on the ground and stuck his pistol in the grandfather's mouth. He never did explain to me why he called 911 instead of shooting the grandfather. I placed him back into my vehicle and told him to remain quiet because I needed to get information from the grandfather to get a conviction. I guess I should also mention I spent several years as a criminal investigator prior to going back to patrol, so I knew exactly what to look for and obtain during the investigation in order to obtain a conviction if a crime did in fact occur. I then brought the grandfather in front of my car and got out a written Miranda form from my car. I read and explained to the grandfather his rights, to which he signed in writing, acknowledging he understood them. The grandfather then waived his rights in writing and spoke to me without an attorney. I tried to play to his emotion and asked him what was happening. He hung his head and told me he did something bad. I tried to belittle it and say stuff like, "At least no one is dead, we can work through this," etc. He proceeded to tell me that he had been molesting his granddaughter for several months and had pretty much done everything but have intercourse with her. I asked him if he photographed any of this activity, and he acknowledged that he did. I asked him where it was. He said it was on the computer. A few jump drives and some new photos should still be on the camera. Thinking about his Fourth Amendment rights, I also got a consent to search form out and requested he sign it to allow me to collect these items. Dumbass signed it, thank God. I would have gotten it anyway with a search warrant due to an overwhelming amount of facts present so far. I collected these items and did my best to comfort this precious little girl. I had my backup transport the grandfather to the jail, and I took the son and child to the office to interview him. Long story short, the grandfather first pled not guilty and a trial date was set. The morning of the trial, he took a plea for 80 years to serve for what he did. As far as how that made me feel, I will never understand how that son didn't turn his own father's head into a canoe. I cannot fathom the rage and anger he must have felt. I kept in contact with the son after the arrest and through the prosecution phases. He eventually told me he didn't shoot him because he didn't want his daughter to lose her grandfather and father in one day. He thought he would go to jail for killing him. I have dealt with more savage people and been in a few rough spots before, but the cold-heartedness demonstrated by this douchebag towards his own granddaughter blew my mind. This woman, as a child, witnessed her parents burned to death in their car after a crash, and she suffered PTSD from that incident. She was in a relationship with a piece of shit who was abusive and, knowing what had happened to her parents and that she was fucked up over it, decided one day to pour gasoline all over her and go through a whole box of matches, casually throwing the lit matches closer and closer to where she was cowering in the corner. She never actually caught fire. The man was arrested at the scene. I was just a backup vehicle, but I will never forget that poor fucking woman. I saw her huddled in a corner, having pissed herself, covered in fuel, just shaking like she was freezing to death. I cannot comprehend the amount of fear she felt. Nothing I have ever experienced or witnessed since has come close to that kind of calculated cruelty before or since. The man was charged with acts with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, but only served a year in prison. I wanted to execute that piece of shit right there. My partner and I chased down a kidnapper and rapist. This guy convinced a drunk girl to go into an alley. While back there, he beat her and tried to rape her. She was wearing jeans, and he couldn't get them off. If she hadn't been wearing jeans, he would have completed the act. A passerby called 911, and my partner and I stopped him less than a block away. His fly was still down, and he hadn't even put his dick back in his pants. We caught a lucky break, too. The entire attack was caught on a security camera, and we were able to immediately obtain it. Watching the video nearly made me cry on duty. With that arrest, we were able to close out 3 other sexual assaults. He was a serial rapist who usually preyed on homeless women. He was homeless himself. It's been a year and a half since the arrest. We go to trial in a few weeks, and I can't wait to put him behind bars for a very long time. I got to arrest a doctor for sexually battering female patients. I've had partners of mine arrest more awful people, but this man I got to arrest. He would only target his female clients who were mental health patients, so that many of their claims would be overlooked due to their existing bipolar disorders or depression. He was a piece of shit, and his wife sat next to him during the entire trial. True love, right? He lost his medical license, but we lost the case due to almost half of his victims refusing to testify and his high-collar, very educated attorney. I was working a late shift on Christmas Eve, which is usually a matter of holding down the fort and counting down the clock until the end of shift. We get a call. Sudden death. An elderly gentleman. A shame, certainly, but nothing more than assumed routine. Inspecting the body for signs of trauma, and calling the undertakers to remove the deceased. We get there and go in. The gentleman is lying on his sofa with a duvet covering him. I perform the usual inspection of the house, looking for anything out of place or suspicious. Not that it'd be easy. The house was like your over-the-top hoarder's palace. After some inquiries, it became apparent that the gentleman had lost the use of his legs many years before and lived downstairs, relying on his daughter to care for him utterly. We have to inspect the body for any signs of trauma or suspicious marks prior to calling the undertaker, so that we are sure that there is nothing untoward in relation to the death. We lift off the blanket, as only his head was showing. The main image that came to mind were the pictures from the liberation of the concentration camps, emaciated and starved corpses. This man had been dead for no more than 4 to 5 hours, yet he was all skin and bone. He relied on his daughter to care for him, and he clearly had not been. He lay there in his own filth, wasting away without anyone properly looking after him. It was utterly despicable. Death has a very distinct smell. It clings to your uniform and your body. I finished my shift in the early hours of the morning, went home and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I just lay there, eyes wide open. The man's body and his haunting stare taking centerpiece in my thoughts. In the end, I thought, fuck it, I'm not gonna get any sleep. So I got in my car and drove 100 miles to my parents to spend Christmas Day with them. Well, what about you? Could you do it? Could you pull someone over for a traffic violation, knowing that you might have to take a bullet for it, or get hit by another vehicle passing by? Could you go into a home for what you thought was a domestic dispute, and end up saving an innocent child from a monster, and still uphold the law? If so, please email me at DuchessDark676@gmail.com. See you next time.